Welcome to my channel. Today we delve into a chilling mystery that begins high above the clouds, where everything seemed calm, predictable, and safe. Flight 708 was supposed to be an ordinary journey, a short hop across the sky that hundreds had taken before. But within minutes, that illusion would shatter. The aircraft would fall from 33,000 feet without warning, without distress calls, without a single clue left to explain why. What began as a peaceful flight turned into a descent no one could stop, no one could understand. For years afterward, investigators would sift through wreckage, theories, and silence, trying to uncover what truly happened to Flight 708, the flight that fell from the sky. It was just after sunrise when Flight 708 prepared for departure. The airport was calm, bathed in soft morning light. Passengers moved through security lines half awake, clutching coffee cups and newspapers. The flight crew greeted them with smiles, unaware that their names would soon become part of aviation history. In the cockpit, the captain and first officer reviewed their pre-flight checklist, their voices steady and routine. Flaps set. Fuel checked. Weather clear. The forecast was perfect, blue skies stretching from horizon to horizon, a smooth ride all the way to their destination. Nothing hinted at the chaos to come. The engines roared to life, and within minutes, Flight 708 lifted gracefully into the air. It climbed steadily, its shadow shrinking against the earth below, and for a while, everything was ordinary. At 33,000 feet, the crew settled into cruise mode. The cockpit was calm, the soft hum of systems, the occasional radio chatter from air traffic control, the rhythmic beeping of instruments. In the cabin, passengers relaxed, flipping through magazines or dozing off against the windows. Flight attendants served breakfast, the smell of coffee drifting through the aisles. It was peaceful, the kind of calm that only exists above the clouds, where the world feels distant and time moves slower. But in the heart of the aircraft, something invisible was already changing. A small indicator light flickered once on the control panel, so briefly that the captain didn't even notice. Then a sound, a faint vibration, subtle but wrong. The first officer frowned, glancing at the gauges. "You hear that?" he asked. The captain nodded. Could be the autopilot trimming out turbulence. Neither of them knew that this sound was the first whisper of a catastrophe already in motion. Minutes later, air traffic control noticed something strange. Flight 708 had begun to drift slightly off its assigned altitude. Controllers radioed in. "Flight 708, confirm altitude 330. Silence. They tried again. Still no response. The radar showed the aircraft descending. Not fast, not yet, but steady enough to raise alarms. In the cockpit, warning lights began to flash. The autopilot disengaged with a sharp tone, and the control column began to shake violently. The first officer grabbed the yoke, pulling back hard. "We're losing altitude," he shouted. The captain's voice cut through, calm but tense. "Engage manual control. Check engines." But when he looked at the instrument panel, his blood ran cold. The altimeter spun downward. The engines were still running, but the aircraft was no longer responding. It was as if the sky itself had turned against them. In the cabin, passengers felt the shift almost instantly. The plane tilted forward, trays sliding off tables, drinks spilling onto the floor. People gasped, clutching their armrests. One mother wrapped her arms around her child, whispering prayers into his hair. The flight attendants struggled to stay on their feet, calling out for passengers to fasten seatbelts. "Please remain calm," one of them shouted, her voice cracking. But calm was gone. The aircraft began to shudder, dropping faster, the roar of air outside rising to a deafening howl. Back in the control tower, controllers watched in horror as the blip representing Flight 708 began to fall rapidly. "Flight 708, this is control. Do you copy?" Still nothing. The descent rate was impossible. They knew what that meant, but they couldn't say it aloud. They watched helplessly as the radar trace disappeared. Just like that, Flight 708 was gone. Rescue teams were dispatched immediately. Helicopters scoured the ocean below, ships diverted from nearby routes to search for survivors. Hours later, they found the first pieces of wreckage, floating fragments of metal, life jackets, and luggage scattered across the wave. There were no survivors. The aircraft had disintegrated on impact. For the investigators who arrived days later, it was a nightmare scene. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, calm and merciless. Somewhere beneath it lay the answers to what had gone wrong, but finding them would take months of grueling work. When the black boxes were recovered, they told a story that only deepened the mystery. The cockpit voice recorder captured calm voices turning to confusion, then fear. "We're losing control," the captain said. "Engines still stable, elevator not responding." Then, a strange sound, a metallic groan, like something tearing apart from within. The recording ended abruptly in static. The flight data recorder showed that every system had functioned normally until just minutes before the crash. There had been no fire, no explosion, no warning. It was as if the plane had simply stopped listening to its pilot. Investigators rebuilt the aircraft piece by piece inside a hangar, every fragment tagged, examined, and placed. It was a puzzle of destruction, each twisted beam and torn panel a clue. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Near the tail section, they found traces of metal fatigue, a hidden fracture buried deep within the structure, invisible to maintenance crews. Over the years, each flight had pushed that crack a little further, until on that fateful morning, it gave way completely. The tail section failed, severing control cables and rendering the aircraft impossible to steer. The crew never stood a chance. The plane didn't fall because of a mistake. It fell because time had been silently eating away at its bones. When the final report was released, it read like a eulogy. The cause of the crash was structural failure due to undetected metal fatigue. But between the lines, it carried a deeper message, one about trust, vigilance, and the fragility of flight. The inspectors knew that Flight 708 had not died in vain. Its loss would lead to changes in how aircraft were inspected, how aging components were monitored, how maintenance records were reviewed. The lives lost had bought knowledge, and that knowledge would save countless others. At the memorial service months later, families stood under gray skies, clutching white flowers as the names of the victims were read aloud. The sound of waves filled the silence between each one. "They left us too soon," one speaker said softly, "but their story will make the skies safer for those who follow." In the distance, a plane flew overhead, steady, silent, a symbol of resilience. Years later, the lessons of Flight 708 continue to shape aviation. Engineers redesigned entire systems to detect structural weaknesses earlier. Airlines implemented stricter inspection schedules. And every time a pilot steps into a cockpit, the quiet knowledge of those who fell before them rides along, a reminder that even in the safest skies, vigilance never ends. The story of Flight 708 is not just about tragedy, it's about the relentless pursuit of truth. In the end, that pursuit turned heartbreak into progress. The flight may have fallen without warning, but its legacy rose higher than anyone could have imagined. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, and you believe these stories remind us why every detail in aviation matters, please consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we honor the lives and lessons that built the skies we trust today. The investigation into Flight 708 became one of the most exhaustive in aviation history. From the very beginning, there was confusion and disbelief, because nothing about this disaster made sense. The weather had been calm, the aircraft had no known mechanical problems, and the pilots were among the most experienced in the airline's fleet. There had been no distress signal, no warning from the cockpit, and no evidence of external interference. The plane had simply dropped out of the sky. To the families of the victims, that lack of answers was unbearable. They needed to know why. To the investigators, it was a haunting puzzle, a mystery written in wreckage, silence, and sea. When the search teams began their recovery mission, the ocean stretched endlessly before them, blue and merciless. They worked in 20-hour shifts, pulling debris from the waves piece by piece. Floating fragments of the fuselage, torn seats, shattered instruments, each one a clue. Divers went deeper, using sonar scanners to map the seabed where larger parts of the aircraft had sunk. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were buried nearly 3,000 feet below the surface, hidden beneath layers of silt and wreckage. Days turned into weeks as ships hovered above the crash site, their cranes and lights casting ghostly reflections on the water. Every night, exhausted crew members returned to their bunks with salt in their hair and the same question in their minds: what made Flight 708 fall? Meanwhile, in a secure hangar back on land, investigators began reconstructing what they had. They laid out every recovered fragment on a massive grid, slowly rebuilding the aircraft from its bones. The twisted metal spoke in its own language, patterns of stress, tears, and impact that revealed the sequence of failure. One thing was clear early on: the plane had broken apart in midair. The debris field was too large, the pieces too far apart, for the crash to have happened on impact with the ground or sea. That meant something catastrophic had occurred at altitude. But what could destroy a jetliner so suddenly, without warning or explosion? Speculation spread quickly across the media. Some claimed the plane had suffered a fuel tank explosion, others whispered about sabotage or a bomb. But the investigators refused to jump to conclusions. Their work demanded patience, precision, and silence. They combed through the aircraft's maintenance records, checking for any sign of prior damage or incomplete repairs. The plane had been serviced just 2 months before the crash. Routine inspection, nothing unusual noted. But as they dug deeper, they found a curious entry. A report from several years earlier mentioning minor structural fatigue observed near the tail section. It had been inspected and cleared for flight. The note was brief, almost dismissive. No further issues had been logged since then. Still, the lead investigator, a quiet man named Captain Rhodes, circled the entry in red. Something about it didn't sit right with him. He had seen this before. Tragedies born not from dramatic failures but from invisible ones. Cracks hidden beneath layers of paint, bolts torqued too tight, panels that had aged just enough to betray their purpose. He had learned that in aviation, the smallest weakness can become the deadliest threat if ignored long enough. His instincts told him the answer lay somewhere in the structure of the aircraft itself, deep within the tail where stress and pressure meet in perfect opposition. So while others chased theories of fire, engine failure, or human error, Rhodes focused his attention there. Weeks later, divers recovered the missing section of the tail fuselage from the ocean floor. It was brought to the surface and placed carefully inside the hangar. When engineers began to examine it, they immediately noticed something strange. The metal along one seam was darker, discolored, as if heat or pressure had altered it. Under closer inspection, they found hairline fractures spreading out like veins from a single point, each one a silent witness to years of stress. When they placed the section under a microscope, the truth began to emerge. The fracture patterns were not the result of impact. They had formed long before the plane hit the sea. The engineers realized they were looking at metal fatigue, a microscopic deterioration that happens over decades of flight cycles. The tail structure, once strong, had weakened so gradually that even the most detailed inspections couldn't see it with the naked eye. Over time, the constant pressurization and depressurization of the cabin had stretched the alloy to its breaking point. On that final flight, when the aircraft reached cruising altitude and the cabin pressure stabilized, the fracture finally gave way. The tail had separated from the fuselage in midair, cutting off control systems and sending the aircraft into a spiraling dive. The pilots had never stood a chance. But before this conclusion was reached, investigators faced another mystery: the strange readings in the flight data recorder. It had shown erratic altitude fluctuations moments before the crash, numbers that didn't make sense. At first, they thought it was an electrical glitch, perhaps damage from the crash itself. But then, they realized the readings were real. The aircraft had tried to climb seconds before its descent, as if the pilots were fighting to regain control. This discovery led to new questions. If the tail had broken off, how had the pilots even been able to attempt recovery? There had to be a moment, a sliver of time, between the first failure and total loss. They turned again to the cockpit voice recorder, replaying the final minutes over and over. The recording began with calm conversation between the captain and first officer, discussing air traffic ahead. Then came a faint sound, a low, metallic groan, like steel under strain. The captain said, "You hear that vibration?" The first officer replied, checking stabilizer trim. Moments later, another noise, a sharp pop, followed by the sudden rush of air and alarms blaring. "We're losing control," the captain shouted. The sound of switches clicking filled the cockpit as they fought the controls. The first officer called out, "No response, elevators gone." Then came the final, chilling words, "Mayday, Mayday, Flight 708, uncontrolled descent, static." Then silence. Hearing those words in the investigation room brought everyone to a standstill. The pilots had done everything right. They had recognized the problem instantly, reacted with skill and professionalism, but the plane had already passed the point of no return. What followed was pure chaos, a fall from the sky that lasted less than 2 minutes but felt like an eternity for those on board. Passengers screamed as gravity betrayed them, the world turning upside down. The sound of metal tearing filled the cabin. The oxygen masks dropped, but many couldn't even reach them. One survivor's phone recording, found later among the wreckage, captured faint cries and prayers, a haunting testament to the final moments of terror. When Captain Rhodes listened to that recording, he sat in silence for a long time. He thought of the people who had boarded that plane that morning, trusting it completely. He thought of the engineers who built it, the mechanics who maintained it, the inspectors who signed off on it. Everyone had done their part, yet somehow the system had failed. The line between safety and disaster was razor-thin, and Flight 708 had slipped right through it. The breakthrough finally came when metallurgists analyzed the recovered tail section under high-resolution imaging. They found that the fatigue fracture had originated from a previous repair, one made decades earlier after a hard landing incident. Instead of replacing the damaged section entirely, the maintenance team had applied a structural patch to save time and cost. It was a decision that met the standards of the time but violated the spirit of safety. Over the years, moisture and vibration had worked their way beneath the patch, corroding the joint from within. It had gone unnoticed through countless inspections until, on that clear morning, it finally failed. As Captain Rhodes read the final report drafts, he realized the cruel truth. The tragedy of Flight 708 had been set in motion long before any of its passengers ever stepped aboard. It was not the storm, not sabotage, not human error. It was time itself, time and a single decision buried in paperwork from years past. The case of Flight 708 was more than a disaster. It was a warning to every airline, every engineer, and every pilot who believed that perfection was permanent. And so, as the investigation moved toward its conclusion, the question was no longer, what happened? But, how do we make sure it never happens again? The wreckage of Flight 708 had given them the answer, but at a cost no one could bear. The plane may have fallen without warning, but its silence had spoken louder than any alarm ever could. Months had passed since the wreckage of Flight 708 was pulled from the ocean, yet for those who worked the investigation, it felt as though time itself had frozen on that morning, the one where the plane disappeared from the radar. The world had moved on, passengers had been buried, and headlines had faded, but in the hangar where the twisted remains of the aircraft lay, silence carried a different weight. The investigators still came in before dawn, coffee in hand, faces marked by fatigue and obsession. They knew they were close to uncovering the full story. But they also knew the truth would not come easy. The wreckage wasn't just metal, it was memory, suffering, and mystery fused together. The hangar lights hummed faintly as Captain Rhodes stood before the reconstructed fuselage. Every piece had been labeled, every fracture mapped. He stared at the tail section that had consumed so much of their time. The metallic skin looked ordinary, dull and gray under the fluorescent light, but to him it was the heart of the story. He knew the answer was hidden there, buried in layers of corrosion and time. He had spent decades studying crash sites, but something about Flight 708 unsettled him more deeply than any other. It wasn't just the scale of the tragedy, it was the feeling that this could have been prevented so easily if someone, years ago, had just cared enough to do one thing differently. In the corner of the hangar, the metallurgists worked tirelessly under microscopes, their screens filled with magnified veins of fractured alloy. The lead engineer called Rhodes over, his voice calm but carrying the weight of revelation. "We've confirmed it," he said quietly. "The crack started here." He pointed to a tiny crescent shape on the image, almost invisible to the naked eye. "This is where the failure began." Rhodes leaned closer, studying the faint line. "From the repair joint?" he asked. The engineer nodded. "Yes. Whoever did the patch decades ago used a bonding technique that wasn't properly sealed. Moisture seeped in over time, and the repeated stress cycles, pressurization, turbulence, temperature changes, all worked together to weaken it. It's what we call slow death fatigue. The fracture propagated over years, until one day, it finally gave way. The simplicity of it hit Rhodes like a punch to the chest. A single oversight. A patch instead of a replacement. It had been enough to bring down a modern jetliner filled with families and children. He closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. "How long do you think it took to form completely?" he asked. "At least 10 years, the engineer replied. "Maybe longer." It was there long before anyone noticed. That night, as the hangar emptied and rain began to fall outside, Rhodes stayed behind. He walked slowly among the fragments, the shredded wing, the scorched seats, the twisted beams of the fuselage. Each piece was silent, but together they screamed of something that had gone horribly wrong. He picked up a small piece of debris, a panel no larger than his hand, and stared at the serial number etched into its edge. He thought of how many flights this aircraft had completed, how many times it had soared safely above the clouds before fate finally caught up. There was something almost cruel about it, how the same sky that once carried laughter and dreams had turned into a grave. As the investigation progressed, more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The flight data recorder had revealed sudden and violent changes in the aircraft's pitch and altitude before the final descent. The tail section's failure had been instantaneous, slicing through critical control cables and causing the aircraft to enter a sharp downward spiral. The pilots had tried to counter it, pulling back on the yoke with every ounce of strength, but the plane no longer obeyed. The moment the tails separated, their fate was sealed. It was not a loss of power, not an explosion, not a fire, it was something far more merciless, the complete loss of control at cruising altitude. In the following weeks, the story began to spread through aviation circles. Other airlines quietly reviewed their old repair records, searching for aircraft with similar tail section modifications. The findings were unsettling. More than a dozen planes worldwide showed the same kind of bonded repairs done decades earlier. Most were retired immediately. It was a race against time, and for some engineers, it felt like uncovering a fleet of ticking bombs hidden in plain sight. Flight 708 had become more than an isolated tragedy, it had become a revelation that sent shockwaves through the entire aviation industry. But even as the truth emerged, the emotional toll deepened. Families of the victims gathered for updates at press briefings, their faces etched with grief and anger. They wanted someone to blame. They wanted accountability. But the responsible engineers, the ones who had made the decision to patch instead of replace, were either retired or long gone. The maintenance company that had overseen the repair no longer existed. There would be no courtroom justice, no simple resolution. The only justice came in the form of knowledge that would prevent this from ever happening again. Still, for many, that wasn't enough. At one of the public hearings, a grieving mother stood up and spoke through tears. "You tell us it was metal fatigue," she said. "You tell us it was invisible. But my son isn't invisible. His life wasn't invisible." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Rhodes felt them pierce through him. He wanted to tell her that he understood, that he carried their pain with him every day, but he also knew that nothing he said would make it better. In private, the investigators compiled the final report. It was clinical, precise, stripped of emotion. It outlined the sequence of events, the structural failure, the misjudged repair, and the chain of decisions that led to disaster. But for Rhodes, the real story couldn't be captured in technical terms. The real story was human. The mechanics under pressure to meet deadlines, the inspectors trusting documentation more than their instincts, the passengers who boarded that morning without fear. Every crash, he believed, was a mirror reflecting not just mechanical failure but the flaws of human nature itself, our tendency to trust systems more than conscience, our comfort with good enough. By the time the report was completed, Flight 708 had already changed aviation forever. The industry introduced stricter inspection protocols, mandating advanced imaging scans for aging aircraft. Engineers redesigned structural components to be more resilient against hidden corrosion. Airlines began investing millions into preventive maintenance, realizing that every dollar saved on shortcuts could cost hundreds of lives later. The lessons of Flight 708 had been carved into the foundations of safety itself. Yet, for Captain Rhodes, the closure felt hollow. On the final night before the report's release, he visited the memorial site built near the ocean where the wreckage had been found. The wind howled softly across the shoreline, carrying the distant sound of waves breaking against the rocks. A line of names was etched into polished stone, illuminated by soft lights. He traced his fingers across the engraved letters, stopping on one, Amelia Torres, age 8. A photograph of a smiling little girl rested beneath it, surrounded by wilted flowers. Rhodes closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every decision, every delay, every overlooked detail that had led to this moment. He knew that in aviation, every rule, every checklist, every inspection procedure had been written in blood. The sky was safe not because it was perfect, but because every tragedy had demanded change. Flight 708 had added its own chapter to that painful book, a reminder that silence is deadly, that the smallest crack can break a world apart. As he stood by the memorial, the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow across the sea. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe deeply. The truth had been found. The story was complete. But the ghosts of Flight 708 would never truly rest. They would fly with every plane that passed through the clouds, whispering their warning to those who dared to forget. The morning of the report's release arrived heavy with anticipation. Outside the Aviation Bureau's headquarters, reporters gathered behind barricades, their cameras pointed at the podium where Captain Rhodes was expected to speak. For weeks, rumors had circulated, whispers of negligence, of old repairs ignored, of something far darker hiding beneath the surface of bureaucracy. The families of the victims sat together in the front row, some clutching photographs, others holding one another's hands tightly, their eyes red but unblinking. They had waited months for answers, months for something to fill the unbearable silence that had followed Flight 708's disappearance. The wind stirred the flags overhead, and as the clock struck 10, Rhodes stepped out, his expression solemn but resolute. He wasn't there to soften the truth. He was there to tell it as it was. When he began speaking, his voice carried not just authority but a deep weariness, the kind born from too many nights spent among wreckage and regret. After months of investigation, he said slowly, We have determined that Flight 708 was lost due to structural failure originating from a repaired section in the aircraft's tail. This failure was not the result of pilot error, sabotage, or weather. It was the result of time, corrosion, and a decision made long ago, a repair that was considered safe then, but was not. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some reporters began typing frantically, others simply stared. Rhodes continued, that small section, that invisible weakness, became the reason 127 lives were lost. It was not seen, not heard, not felt, until it was too late. His words hung in the air like smoke. Behind him, screens displayed diagrams of the aircraft structure, showing where the crack had begun and how it spread across the tail under years of strain. It looked almost delicate, like a spider's web, fragile, intricate, deadly. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint clicking of camera shutters. Then came the questions. Could this have been prevented? One reporter called out. Rhodes hesitated before answering. Yes, he said quietly. It could have been. But not by one person, by a system that had grown too comfortable. That sentence would make headlines across the world. It wasn't just a technical admission, it was a moral one. The airline had followed every procedure, every checklist. The inspectors had signed off on every repair. The engineers had followed the manuals. Yet still, the plane had fallen. The implication was clear. Safety had been treated as a box to check, not a responsibility to feel. It was a statement that would shake the aviation world to its core. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was immense. Government agencies launched reviews of aging aircraft fleets across multiple airlines. Engineers scrambled to locate similar bonded repairs made in the 1970s and 1980s. Patches once thought reliable, now reclassified as potential threat. Entire sections of aircraft maintenance manuals were rewritten. A quiet reckoning spread through the industry, one that replaced confidence with humility. For the first time in years, the illusion of invincibility was gone. But while regulators and engineers worked to reform the system, the human side of the tragedy unfolded more painfully. The families of the victims, once united by grief, began to splinter under the strain of anger and litigation. Lawsuits were filed against the airline, the manufacturers, even the maintenance subcontractors from decades earlier. None of them could undo what had happened, but they sought accountability, some small measure of justice in a system that had failed to protect them. The airline's executives made public apologies, but their words fell flat, sounding scripted and hollow. They spoke of unforeseen circumstances, of rare mechanical anomalies, but the families had heard enough excuses to last a lifetime. In private, Rhodes continued his work, reviewing other ongoing investigations. But Flight 708 stayed with him. Some nights, he would wake from dreams of the ocean swallowing twisted metal, of faint voices calling from a distance he could never reach. It wasn't guilt. He had done everything he could, but rather the haunting knowledge that he was now a keeper of stories too heavy to tell. Each crash he investigated became part of him, each set of names etched deeper into memory. One evening, long after the media frenzy had faded, Rhodes sat in his office surrounded by case files. A young journalist had requested an interview, claiming she wanted to write a piece about the hidden heroes of crash investigations. She was polite, curious, and relentless in her questions. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you look at all that loss and still come back every day?" Rhodes leaned back, his eyes distant. "Because someone has to," he said. "Because every time we find the truth, someone else doesn't have to die for it." She scribbled his words down, but he wasn't speaking for her article, he was speaking for himself. That same night, a courier delivered a small envelope to his office. Inside was a letter from one of the victims' families, the mother of a boy who had been traveling alone on Flight 708 to visit his father. Her handwriting was shaky but careful. "Dear Captain Rhodes," it began, "I watched your speech. I wanted to be angry at someone, at you, at the airline, at the sky itself. But when you spoke, I realized you cared. You saw my son not as a statistic, but as a person. You gave him a voice when the world moved on. For that I thank you." Rhodes read the letter twice before folding it neatly and placing it in his desk drawer. It stayed there for the rest of his career. Months turned into years, and the legacy of Flight 708 began to take shape in more tangible ways. The airline introduced a memorial scholarship for engineering students focused on aviation safety. International regulations were updated to include what came to be known as the 708 Protocol, a mandate requiring deep structure scanning for all aircraft over 15 years old. Training programs worldwide began using the Flight 708 case as a teaching model for how a chain of small decisions could lead to unimaginable consequences. The story of the flight became not just a tragedy, but a cornerstone of modern safety culture. Yet, even as progress was made, Rhodes couldn't shake the quiet sadness that came with knowing how high the cost of every improvement truly was. The system evolved through loss. Every advancement was written in the lives of those who had been taken too soon. He thought often of the families who would never get to say goodbye, of the little girl whose name he'd traced at the memorial, of the hundreds of empty seats that would never again carry laughter or conversation. Aviation was safer than ever, but safety built on sorrow never felt like victory. Years later, when Rhodes finally retired, his colleagues threw him a small farewell gathering. They celebrated his career, his integrity, the countless lives he'd helped save through his relentless pursuit of truth. When it was his turn to speak, he looked around the room filled with young investigators and engineers, the next generation who would carry the burden forward. "Remember this," he said softly. "Every time you walk into a wreckage site, you're standing on sacred ground. You're not just finding evidence. You're listening to the last story those people ever told. Treat it with the respect it deserves." The room fell silent. Some nodded, others fought back tears. It was a quiet reminder that in the world of aviation investigation, empathy mattered just as much as expertise. That night, Rhodes drove out to the coast one last time. The memorial still stood there, untouched, facing the sea. He sat on a bench as the tide came in, the waves glinting under the fading light. Far above, the contrails of distant jets crisscrossed the sky, thin white lines against an endless blue canvas. He watched them disappear over the horizon and thought about how fragile it all was, how every flight was both a miracle and a risk. Then he whispered to the wind, "Fly safe." It wasn't a prayer, not exactly. It was a farewell, to the skies, to the ghosts, to the flight that had fallen but would never be forgotten. In the end, Flight 708 was more than a headline, more than a mystery solved. It was a reminder written in cloud and metal, that safety is not inherited, it is earned every single day. The plane had fallen without warning, but from its fall came a truth that would rise higher than any altitude, that vigilance, compassion, and responsibility are the wings that keep humanity in the air. And for Rhodes, that was enough. Years after the world had moved on from the headline, the name Flight 708 still lived quietly in hangars, classrooms, and control towers, a ghost woven into the language of aviation safety. It was no longer just a tragedy. It had become a lesson, a reference, a warning etched into procedure manuals and training simulators. But for those who had lived through the investigation, who had smelled the salt on twisted metal and read the final words from the cockpit, it was never just history. It was something deeper, a reminder that every flight carried a human heartbeat behind the machines and numbers. Captain Rhodes had retired, but his mind often drifted back to the case that had defined his life. Even in quiet moments, he could still hear the echo of static from the black box, the trembling voice of the first officer, the haunting silence that followed. One autumn morning, long after he had left his desk and badge behind, Rhodes received a call from a young engineer named Claire Stanton. She introduced herself as part of a research team developing a new structural diagnostic system, a system that used acoustic resonance to detect microfractures in aircraft frames, the kind of flaw that had doomed Flight 708. "Your investigation inspired this project," she said, her voice steady but reverent. "We're calling it Project Phoenix. We'd be honored if you'd come see it." Rhodes hesitated at first. He had spent years trying to leave the wreckage behind, to stop reliving the nightmares of twisted aluminum and lost lives. But something in her voice, a quiet conviction, pulled him back. A few weeks later, he boarded a flight for the first time in years. As the plane climbed through the clouds, Rhodes felt the old tension rise in his chest. Every vibration, every sound made him hyper-aware. The engines hummed steadily, and the seatbelt sign flicked off. He glanced out the window at the endless blue stretching beneath him. It was beautiful, yes, but also fragile. The same serenity that had preceded so many disasters lay before him now. He closed his eyes and whispered softly to himself, "Trust the sky, but never forget it." When he arrived at the research facility, he was greeted by Claire and her team. The lab was sleek and modern, filled with soft light and the hum of computers. In the center stood the test rig, a gleaming cross-section of an aircraft tail. Dozens of sensors and laser scanners traced its contours. Claire smiled as she began the demonstration. "This technology can detect internal fatigue before it even reaches the surface," she explained. "It hears the metal breathe. The moment it begins to fail, even invisibly, we'll know." She tapped a command on her tablet, and the screen lit up with waves of data. A faint pulse appeared, tiny vibrations moving through the alloy, patterns so subtle they were almost music. "This," she said, "is what silence sounds like before disaster." Rhodes stood there, transfixed. It was as if all the pain, all the endless nights of piecing together tragedy, had finally built to this, a way to stop the next Flight 708 before it ever took off. "We'll never be perfect," Claire said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "But maybe we can finally hear the warnings we used to miss." Rhodes smiled faintly. "Then you're listening to ghosts," he replied. She nodded. "Yes. And they're teaching us how to fly safer." Over the following months, Rhodes became an unofficial advisor to the project. He reviewed crash data, shared his field experiences, and taught the young engineers not just the science of investigation, but the empathy behind it. "Every number you analyze," he told them, "represents someone who believed they were safe. Never forget that." His words became a kind of mantra within the team. They hung a small brass plaque on the wall beside the testing rig. It read, "In memory of Flight 708, so that others may live." Meanwhile, the airline that had operated Flight 708 also sought to rebuild its reputation. A decade of silence had followed the crash, marked by lawsuits, settlements, and public distrust. But now, a new generation of leaders emerged within the company. Pilots turned executives, engineers who had grown up studying the tragedy as a cautionary tale. They reached out to Rhodes, inviting him to participate in the dedication of a new training center for aviation safety named after the victims. He was hesitant, but he agreed. The day of the dedication, the facility was filled with students, pilots, and reporters. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and polished steel. Behind the podium hung a mural of clouds painted in soft blues and silvers, with a single phrase across the top: "Every flight remembers." Rhodes took the stage, his hair now silver, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't speak from notes. He never needed them. "When we lost Flight 708, he began, "we didn't just lose lives, we lost trust. Trust in our systems, our vigilance, our belief that we were untouchable. But the truth is, safety is never guaranteed. It's earned, every single day, through every inspection, every checklist, every honest admission that we can always do better. The moment we think we've conquered the sky, it will remind us who's in charge." The room was silent, his words resonating like engines fading into the distance. Afterward, a pilot approached him, a young woman with sharp eyes and steady hands. "Sir," she said, I was a child when Flight 708 fell. My father was one of the passengers. I became a pilot because of that day. I wanted to make sure what happened to him would never happen to anyone else." Rhodes stared at her, struck speechless. The weight of her words filled the space between them. He finally managed a quiet reply. "Then he didn't die in vain." In the years that followed, Rhodes became a quiet legend in the aviation world. His work was cited in training programs, his interviews studied in safety conferences. But he never saw himself as a hero, only as a messenger of hard-earned truths. When Project Phoenix finally launched its first successful test flight equipped with the new detection system, the announcement made headlines across the world. The technology detected microfractures in an aircraft wing during pre-flight inspection, cracks that, left unnoticed, could have led to disaster months later. It was hailed as a revolution. But when reporters asked Rhodes for a comment, he gave the same simple answer every time. "It wasn't me. It was the people who died teaching us to listen." On his final visit to the Coastal Memorial years later, Rhodes found that time had softened the pain but not the memory. The granite walls gleamed under the afternoon sun, the names still etched clearly. Fresh flowers lay at the base, left by people he didn't know, new generations who had never heard the screams, never seen the wreckage, but still came to remember. He sat on the same bench as before, watching contrails drift across the sky. The sound of the waves filled the silence, steady and eternal. Somewhere far above, a plane cut through the clouds, its engines distant but strong. He felt no fear this time, only peace. He knew that in every tower, in every cockpit, in every hangar where an engineer bent over a checklist, the legacy of Flight 708 lived on. It was in the vigilance of a mechanic double-checking a bolt, in the calm voice of a pilot reading out altitude, in the eyes of a young investigator looking at wreckage not as failure but as instruction. The flight had fallen, yes, but from that fall had risen a culture of safety that would guard countless lives for generations to come. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Rhodes whispered the same words he had spoken years ago: "Fly safe." He stood, took one last look at the sea, and smiled. Somewhere in the vast silence of the sky, he imagined Flight 708 soaring again, not as wreckage or tragedy, but as a symbol of resilience, of learning, of hope reborn. The story was no longer about how it fell, but how, from its fall, the world learned to rise. In the quiet years that followed, the name Flight 708 became more than a tragedy. It became a compass, a moral instrument guiding the aviation world toward humility and precision. Every investigation, every safety audit, every training seminar echoed with its lessons. It was spoken in classrooms and hangars not with fear, but with reverence. The sky had taken lives that day, but it had also given humanity something rare, a second chance to listen to its own fragility. For Captain Rhodes, now an old man living by the sea, that was the only comfort he needed. His career had ended long ago, but the ghosts of Flight 708 had never left him. They didn't haunt him with screams or nightmares anymore. They lived quietly in his memories, as faces, as moments, as voices he could never forget. Each morning, Rhodes rose early, walked along the shoreline, and watched the contrails cross the sky like white scars healing above the blue horizon. He could still recognize the types of aircraft by their silhouettes, the subtle angle of a tail fin, the rhythm of the engine hum. Sometimes he smiled when he saw them, but other times, a heaviness stirred inside him. He had spent a lifetime making sure people trusted the sky again, yet he knew that trust was never permanent. It was something that had to be rebuilt every day, with every flight, every pre-check, every honest report that dared to say, "This isn't safe yet." That was the truth most people never saw. Flying wasn't about conquering the heavens, it was about respecting them. One afternoon, while he was tending to the small memorial garden near his home, a patch of wildflowers overlooking the same ocean where Flight 708 had vanished, Rhodes received a letter from the International Aviation Council. It invited him to a ceremony in Geneva, where he was to be honored for his lifetime contribution to global flight safety. He almost laughed at the irony. He never saw himself as a savior of anything. He was just a man who refused to let unanswered questions stay buried. But as he read further, he noticed something that made him pause. The award was to be given in the newly established Flight 708 Safety Hall, a facility dedicated entirely to learning from air disasters past and present. His hands trembled slightly as he set the letter down. After all these years, the number that once symbolized grief had become a beacon of vigilance. Weeks later, Rhodes boarded another flight, perhaps his last. He sat quietly in his window seat as the engines rumbled to life. The cabin smelled of recycled air and coffee, the same familiar mixture that had always reminded him of the fragility of routine. The flight attendants smiled warmly as they moved down the aisle, their calm professionalism a quiet triumph over fear. As the plane lifted through layers of cloud, sunlight poured through the windows, turning the interior golden. He gazed out at the endless expanse below, remembering the faces of the crew from Flight 708, the captain with steady hands, the young first officer eager to prove himself, the flight attendants who had comforted terrified passengers until the very end. They weren't numbers in a report anymore, they were the reason the sky was safer now. He whispered their names softly, as if the wind might carry them home. The ceremony in Geneva was held inside a glass building that overlooked a runway, where planes constantly rose and landed beyond the horizon. The hall itself was silent and simple. In the center stood a monument carved from the recovered metal of Flight 708's fuselage, polished to a reflective silver that caught the light from above. Etched into it were the words, "From silence we learned to listen." Rhodes stood before it, his reflection wavering against the metal surface. Around him, pilots, engineers, and investigators from all over the world had gathered. They represented decades of progress born from pain, hundreds of lives saved because one tragedy had forced humanity to see where it had grown complacent. When he was asked to speak, Rhodes didn't prepare a grand speech. He simply stepped forward and spoke from his heart. "I once believed that when we finished an investigation, we were closing a story," he began, his voice quiet but unwavering. "But I learned that we never close it. We only turn the page. Every time we find an answer, we leave a message for those who will come after us. Pay attention. Don't look away. Never forget. The people of Flight 708 may have fallen from the sky, but their legacy rose higher than any aircraft ever could. They taught us that the smallest fracture, the smallest hesitation, the smallest assumption can cost everything, and that listening to silence can save lives." There was a stillness after he spoke, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of understanding. As he stepped down, a group of young cadet investigators approached him, their eyes wide with admiration. One of them, barely 20, said, "Sir, your work is the reason I joined the Bureau. I want to make sure the sky never forgets what happened." Rhodes smiled faintly, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Good," he said softly, "because the moment we stop remembering, the sky will remind us." That night, as he walked back to his hotel, snow began to fall gently over the quiet streets of Geneva. The world felt at peace, as if the air itself had exhaled. He stopped by the river, watching the white flakes settle on the water's surface and disappear. He thought about how every life lost in the air had become part of something eternal, not gone, but transformed into a warning, a whisper, a lesson written in the language of wind and steel. The world had learned, not through fear, but through remembrance. Years passed, and the technology that had begun as Project Phoenix became a global standard. Aircraft could now detect microscopic fractures before they even formed, predicting failure long before danger arose. Planes grew stronger, smarter, more aware. But deep down, Rhodes knew it wasn't technology that truly made the difference. It was humility. Machines could warn, systems could analyze, but only people could choose to care enough to listen. The spirit of Flight 708 had become exactly that. Not a machine, not a law, but a promise. When Rhodes finally passed away quietly in his sleep at the age of 86, the aviation world mourned not just the man, but what he represented, a bridge between loss and progress, between silence and truth. At his funeral, a formation of aircraft flew low over the ocean where Flight 708 had been lost decades before. As the jets passed overhead, their engines roared not in grief but in gratitude. The sea reflected their silver trails, merging sky and water into one endless horizon. At the memorial, a new inscription was added beneath the names of the victims. They taught us how to fly again. And so, the legacy of Flight 708 lived on, not as tragedy, not as data, but as a timeless reminder that even in the darkest descent, humanity can rise again. The story had begun with a fall, but it ended with flight, endless, eternal, and free.